I'm not really a nuclear person. I'm a kind of a biogeochemist who spent my career kind of working on the edge of nuclear stuff, but there's a lot of overlap, and I think what I have to say will hopefully still be relevant. Um, I've called my presentation How to Sell Your Skills as an Academic, and I kind of probably should put the disclaimer on there that I'm not a careers coach. Like, this is just based on my own experience, but it's definitely something that I've been working on over the past 12 months when I was faced with that. What's probably familiar kind of contract is coming up to end. You're starting to think about what your next steps are. But yeah, luckily for me, I was successful. So I've got a permanent contract at the University of Stirling as a lecturer in earth and environmental chemistry. I started that at the beginning of March, so it's still quite new at the moment. And also currently, as of yesterday, I am now also a research and development fellow working for DEFRA, so the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs of the UK government, which is also something interesting to do kind of alongside my permanent academic job. Okay, how do I move on? There we go. So I'm going to start just by giving you an introduction to who I am, like my CV, the kind of pathway journey that I've gone through to get to where I am today. Hopefully that will be useful to consider. So my PhD it's from Newcastle in environmental engineering. So I've kind of worked with iron-bearing minerals and pollutant transformation in one way or another throughout my career. It was interesting already to be based in an engineering department during my PhD. You know, my background is very much kind of environmental science, biogeochemistry. But I think I really benefited from being in this engineering school. It meant that I could kind of get some access to seminars that were mostly focused on kind of water treatment from a quite industrial point of view for an academic department. Okay, yeah, so I was mostly working in the lab. Like, I've put these pictures of the top of this specific type of spectroscopy that I've worked on throughout my career, which I think it's kind of been the common thread, and it's been something that really helped me get jobs. So if I move forward to my postdoc position, after my PhD, I moved to Zurich to work as a postdoc in the soil chemistry group. So I think what really kind of got me there was this specialism in this type of spectroscopy that kind of got me in there. Here, my career took a little bit of a turn towards kind of more field-based techniques, kind of complementing the lab-based stuff I did during my PhD. I think things that I particularly benefited from here, it was the field work. So for example, we had a lot of connections in the national parks where we were working, where we had to apply for permits, who'd give us tours around the particular sites and things like that. Really helped to expand my network. And also I've now got kind of collaborators from all over the world who were at one point my colleagues, who are now kind of really useful points of contact for potential collaboration. Okay, so after I was a postdoc, I got this position at the University of Bristol. So this was a lecturer position, but it was on a kind of temporary basis. It was maternity cover, so there was really kind of no option to extend it at the end. And for me, it was a really nice opportunity to move back to the UK, which was something that I decided I wanted to do. I wanted to kind of build my career in the UK rather than somewhere in Switzerland or in Europe. So this was a nice stepping stone to do that, but obviously it still kind of trapped me into the academic thing where you've got precarious contracts, you're moving around the world really based on this. But I think in the long run, it was a good position to take, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. I think so during my contract in Bristol, I did apply for the big fellowships, the kind of, the NERC Independent Fellowship, there's and a few others that you're possibly familiar with if you're considering that kind of career pathway that will pay your salary for kind of 5 to 8 years, depending on what you're looking at, and allow you to do your own piece of independent research. They're very, very competitive. I'm glad that I applied. It was good experience writing the application, but it's a big time commitment to, and none of the ones I applied for, I was successful even getting an interview, and you've spent kind of weeks of work writing this grant. It can be a little tricky to navigate. But anyway, you'll see on the slide here, I still have the Mussbauer. It was a thing that definitely, helped me again. I had this network of people that used it. Bristol's a centre that uses it. It just kind of helped me get this role, I think. I've also got this picture of the ship. So this is the SS Great Britain. As I said, I was unsuccessful getting the kind of big pots of money at that point, but I did get this kind of small pot of money to work on this project with the ship, looking at their corrosion. This was kind of moving from iron chemistry in the environment to iron chemistry in more engineered setting, which is quite interesting. And again, it was really helpful, kind of expanding my network into more kind of heritage science as well. But obviously, this was a temporary contract. I got to the end of this, and you really have to, think about what now. And it was definitely not a nice position to be in. I'm sure there's lots of people here familiar with this. Having the kind of temporary lecturer position put me in a good position to kind of see whether this was something that I wanted to keep up with. So here I've kind of summarized what I think are the pros and cons for an academic job. And I mean, this is something you could really talk about for all day. But for me, the pros, it's really the flexibility to lead your own research and spend as much time as you want investigating what you want, which is, I think it's quite difficult to get that anywhere else. Even if you're working in the kind of industrial research sector, they tend to be much smaller projects. You might not be in charge of what you're specifically working on. This is kind of really a nice thing from academia. I do really like teaching. I know maybe some people, this is a bigger draw for some academics than others, but I like that kind of ability to, you meet the students in first year, you have duties, you can really get to know them, and it's really rewarding to see them moving through their degrees and their career paths. And in academia, generally, you work with a range of really interesting people, although of course that's not solely true for academia. But of course, like it does come with cons. So the precarious contract is a really big drawback. It can be something that's really quite difficult to navigate on a personal level. Chasing funding is something that you constantly have to do. So now I have this permanent position, but I still need to, find some money to do the research that I want to do. And it can be really quite difficult to deal with this. So for example, I've been involved in a proposal to get some funding to continue working on the ship work that I mentioned. So with some collaborators, we put in the grant proposal last year. It was rated really highly, so it was given an A. It was decided that it was fundable, but there wasn't enough money to fund all of the projects that had been rated as fundable. So they then put the grant through a lottery, and we were unsuccessful in the lottery and said, reapply this year. We reapplied this year, exactly the same proposal, like tweak. So if anything, it should have been a better proposal, and this time it was rated quite badly. So you just kind of have to deal with this kind of lottery of whether your grants are successful or not. The workload can be difficult to deal with, and I'm not necessarily saying that academia means that you're going to have an unmanageable workload and lots to do. I guess what I specifically mean is things like, for example, if you take annual leave, you want to go on holiday for a week, in a lot of other roles, somebody will just take over your workload for a week. Whereas in academia, you come back and you're just a week behind on what you were working on. Like your paper is going to come out a week later, for example. There's nobody else that's going to pick up the slack if you're not there. And also this kind of thing where you have to be everything. So I guess I mean by this, academia is probably relatively unique in that you have to be a project manager as well as a technical expert. You have to do your own outreach and social media, for example, whereas in some industrial roles, you would have somebody who is the project manager, somebody who is the technical lead, and somebody who's the kind of communication specialist, for example. So with this in mind, I was still applying for academic jobs. Obviously, this is the path I've ended up on, but I really considered a range of career paths at the end of my contract. I applied for a few kind of consultancy roles. My heart wasn't particularly in this. I'm not very commercially minded. It wasn't really the pathway for me. I looked at some kind of heritage material science jobs, and more kind of third sector research roles or technical roles. So for example, with like wetlands trusts or wildlife trusts, kind of organizations like that. I applied for one other postdoc position. I really didn't want to continue with the precarious short-term contracts, but it was a really interesting postdoc, so I applied for it. I've applied for a few roles in the civil service, and then I wrote 3 academic job applications as well, 2 of which I didn't get an interview for. One of them I got an interview for and was ultimately successful. Okay, so yeah, this is where we are today, where I'm a lecturer at the University of Stirling. Again, we have this picture is a Moosbauer. We have that here. I'm not sure if that really helped me get the role, but it's just the one kind of common thread for my degree, I would say, career, I would say. And then my DEFRA work, where I'm now working on something quite different. So it's the kind of implications of planting trees and peatlands. It's still kind of a research role, but it's very much from a policy perspective. But as I said, it's my second day here. I've not got too much to say on that for now. Okay. But yeah, I'll move on just to kind of talk about my experience with applying for jobs now. Again, this is my opinion. This is how it worked for me. It's not necessarily, the case that this would work for everybody. And I think, as for a lot of things in life, a lot of what has worked for me has basically been I've been in the right place at the right time. But yeah, I would say the general trends I have identified from, just reflection on what's gone well, is that my success in applying for academic jobs really came after I'd gotten used to applying to lots of different roles. So thinking about what Pardee was talking about with more industrial focused roles, like this has really ranged from kind of very informal applications. I think that was mostly for kind of postdoc roles, particularly international postdoc roles. A lot of UK universities have like a more formalized application process. But for example, my job in Switzerland, it was just a short cover letter and a CV, and the interview was very much just a chat, getting to know each other rather than any kind of structured formal questioning. And the thing that I think that has really helped me was actually applying for civil service roles, because they're kind of perhaps quite on the extreme end of a formalized application process where you're really kind of expected to give examples that show your strengths, your abilities, experiences, technical skills, and things that they call behaviors. So that was something to kind of, it really helped me think about, although I have just an academic career portfolio, how to draw out what was useful for a particular role, what was transferable, what was kind of relevant where. So I really recommend going and having, even if you're not interested in the civil service at all, going and having a look at their kind of recruitment website and just their instructions for kind of applying for jobs, because I think that really helps me just pull out, what makes me individual, what are my strengths, and really improve my ability to sell myself. Okay, so I'm just going to move into some examples and some tips that I have. I've put in a slide about generative AI. I know it's controversial, not everybody wants to use it because of, carbon reasons or moral reasons or whatever, but it's something that I have used. So I've just going to put my hands up and say, this is how I used it. Don't use it to generate a cover letter or any kind of text. One of my academic roles is kind of overseeing undergraduate internships. And there it's very, very obvious when a cover letter is AI generated, you start to see these very flowery words. And even if, you've just used it to improve your language, if, somebody picks up that you're using it, they might start thinking maybe this has kind of been more generated. So just be, use it critically if you're using it. Be quite careful here. Okay, so what I did use it for was feeding in kind of job adverts and asking it, give it the job advert and say what skills are important here, what keywords are important here. A lot of kind of job applications, they will use software on the other end to analyze your answers and pick out keywords and then kind of rate applications by that before they're even seen by a human. So if you're using these kind of right keywords to start with, your application's much more likely to be given the time of day. I also used it to ask for examples of how to evidence particular skills. So I'm not saying, just ask it to generate an example of how I'm a good project manager and it makes up something that you've not done. But I found it really useful to kind of get out of my academic mindset and actually say, in what ways do academics act as project managers? What examples are actually useful to evidence here to support my job application, if that makes sense. But yeah, obviously always be critical and mindful of how you're using it. Okay, so I'm mindful that I've probably been talking for a long time already, so I've picked out 3 or 4 examples that have come up either in kind of an interview situation or in a cover letter / online portal, give an example of how you manage your workload. Again, I've highlighted STAR here. Purdy gave a good explanation of this, so I won't repeat it. But I think this is particularly managing a workload and prioritizing. It's something that we all do as academics, and we're maybe quite actually bad at articulating that this is our job, when really, a PhD project, there's probably not much out there that, people do that's bigger than this. You've got 3 to 4 years of funding where it's, just one big body of work where you have to think about the budgeting, time planning and management, and the kind of getting the deliverables out in the right kind of time frame. And that language can already seem a little bit alien to an academic, but I think once I really got comfortable with, this is what I'm doing and how to sell it, then it really benefited me. So the example here of, a PhD project is already an example, but for specifics that I picked out is kind of this field study, because it's a smaller thing within a PhD project that I could talk about, particularly things like permitting applications, training and coordinating with team members, and kind of contingency planning, and then using kind of regular progress reviewing to make sure that what we were doing was actually working. And there's kind of loads of these examples. So for example, you can talk about time conflicts. Like in academia, we're always kind of stuck between teaching pressures or kind of different role pressures and lab work and kind of communication work. It's good for thinking about questions about working under, pressure and at a fast pace. And we also have, I think Purdy mentioned this, like it's, as academics, we're constantly having to prioritize. You do one thing in the lab, you're like, oh, this isn't working so well. Do I keep sinking my time into this, or do I move on and kind of do something else that might be a little bit more efficient? If that makes sense. Okay, so another example that I was asked about in an interview was how have I managed conflict in a team? And again, this is something that I think as an academic, I came into this and I was like, whoa, I work independently. Like there'll be other people in the lab, but it's not necessarily common that people are working in a team in the way that kind of industry works exactly. So here I picked out an example from when I was a postdoc. Here we were all working together on a big grant, so it was more of kind of normal team than you quite often get in academia, where you're just working on your own projects. And to start with, there was just kind of some teething problems, miscommunications, where some PhD students felt like they were working on overlapping things. They were struggling to communicate that to the PI, and kind of as a postdoc in the middle, I could kind of mediate between them and kind of initiate meetings to make sure we could iron out any problems that we were having. Yes, and then I think the final example I have here for just specific examples is communication. Again, as academics, you might come out and straight away, well, I spend my life writing, I spend my life giving presentations, but generally it's at quite a technical level. You're writing manuscripts, you're giving presentations at conferences, you're using lots of jargon, and that kind of barrier of communicating to a wider audience might be, difficult to evidence. So I think here doing this kind of interdisciplinary research has really benefited me. Like I could talk about how with the SHIP research, it wasn't just communicating to, peers working on this kind of material science issues, is communicating maybe to academics from a more kind of heritage background, communicating to the kind of charity trustees themselves who might not have any scientific background at all, kind of just examples where you're translating what you're doing so that it becomes digestible depending on the audience that you have. Okay, so I'm not going to talk through all of this slide because it's loads of text, but yeah, I mentioned I'm now working with DEFRA as this research fellow. So the application for this project wasn't like a standard fellowship where you write a huge long proposal. It was very much just like a broad, vague, why do you want to work to DEFRA? What skills would you bring to DEFRA? And as kind of a scientist who spend most of their life either doing chemistry in the lab or working in the field, skills like I can fit this spectroscopic data, I can do this chemistry, I can do this modeling isn't necessarily useful when you're in a policy environment. So I had to kind of really, go back to basics, pull out what am I good at, what am I actually doing here that's transferable. So like applying expertise outside immediate specialty, conveying complex information, being self-motivated. Like this is something that you kind of maybe might take for granted if you've been an academic all your life, but it's actually quite difficult to just be as, independent, go and do your thing with very little guidance. So yeah, I'll leave this up so you can have a read of it, but I'm not going to read it all because I'm talking for too long. Okay, so I kind of come towards the end now. I just have some kind of general thoughts of what do I have on my CV that really helped. So the interdisciplinary work, I think that's something that I would talk about in most of the interviews that I've had. It's really nice, just examples of, project management, communicating to different people, having kind of tangible examples of where my work has made a difference. Having a small grant helped, and having partners outside of academia helped. And then teaching experience was definitely useful. Kind of when I took this temporary lecturer position in Bristol, it was a toss-up between, I kind of finished the postdoc project a little bit early. I hadn't finished publishing what I was doing. It was kind of front-loading the teaching at the expense of having a better research CV. And at the time, I wasn't sure if this was the right idea, but I think it did pay off. And then I've also been involved in some kind of outreach work, which I think definitely helped. I have a list of things that didn't matter as much as I thought it would. So my publication record is not particularly stellar. My H-index is 6 or something. As I said, I kind of prioritized the teaching experience over that. And for a while, I kind of almost gave up with academic applications because I was like, well, I just don't have the record there for it to work. But in the end, it was okay. And I think the international experience, this is something that I do have. But it's not something that I've really ever mentioned in applications or interviews. So I don't think that really helped me that much. Obviously, I still benefited from having the network and the experience in different places. But yeah, so I think I'll finish with just one slide with comparison is the thief of confidence. This was definitely true for me. Academia is so, you have such a wide skill set and it's very easy to compare yourself to somebody else whose strengths are different to yours. And you might look at them and say, okay, they're a shoo-in to get this academic job because they have this skills, whereas you're completely ignoring that you actually have your own set of skills that are completely different to theirs. And I think I got very hung up with comparing myself to other people, which was not a helpful thing. And if you're kind of in this trap, don't fall for it. Okay, I have one last slide that I'll just skip through. And again, it's something that might be useful for you to go through in your own time, kind of sets of interview questions that I've been asked. So this first set is very much focused on kind of research things. And then there is also a second set kind of focused on teaching to give you an idea of the things that you might be asked in an academic interview.